In 1954, a man named Raymond Patriarca took control of the New England Mafia from a vending machine office at 168 Atwells Avenue, Federal Hill, Providence, Rhode Island. He would hold it for 30 years. In 1974, the city elected a 33-year-old prosecutor named Vincent Cianci on the promise of cleaning it up. He would govern for parts of 3 decades, go to federal prison for racketeering, and return twice. In 1978, at the precise moment both men were at the height of their power, Providence employed 32,500 jewelry workers and manufactured 25% of everything America wore around its neck, on its wrists, on its hands. The factories were hollowing out. The mayor was selling city contracts. The patriarch of Federal Hill was collecting tribute. 3 systems, industry, government, and organized crime, were all failing in the same city at the same time, and for reasons that were not entirely unconnected. This is the story of both rots. Chapter 1. The City of Conscience. In 1636, a man named Roger Williams arrived at the eastern bank of the Seekonk River in the middle of winter and kept walking. He had been expelled from the Massachusetts Bay Colony for what the magistrates called dangerous opinions. That civil authority had no reach over a man's soul, that the king's charter could not grant land the Narragansett already occupied, that a church which required the state's arm to enforce its doctrine was not a church worth having. The court gave him 6 weeks before they sent him to England in chains. He left before they could. What he found, after crossing the Seekonk by canoe and negotiating with the sachems Canonicus and Miantonomy for a parcel of land at the confluence of 2 rivers, was a place that held no prior claims on him. He called it Providence. The name was not accidental. It was a theological statement, a declaration that what had just happened to him, the banishment, the winter crossing, the strip of land between a river and a salt bay, was arranged by forces larger than the General Court of Massachusetts. He had been delivered here. He intended to make something of it. The geography cooperated. The town sat at the head of Narragansett Bay, a long, forked estuary cutting 30 miles into the New England interior, its western passage deep enough for ocean-going vessels, its eastern shore rising sharply from the waterline in a ridge of glacially deposited land that gave the original settlers their most durable orientation, their backs to the hill, their faces to the water. Providence was a harbor town before it was anything else. The rivers, the Moshassuck from the north, the Woonasquatucket from the west, joined just before meeting the tidal cove that opened to the bay. Wherever you stood in those first decades, you were within earshot of moving water. Williams wrote a charter for his settlement unlike anything in the Western world at that moment. It guaranteed that no man would be questioned by the civil authority for his religious opinions. Baptists came, Quakers came, Sephardic Jews arrived in the 1650s and built what would become, a century later, the oldest synagogue in North America. Dissenters from every sect and stripe of the English-speaking world made their way to Narragansett Bay because Providence had made a promise that other colonies had not, that the matter of a man's soul was his own business entirely and no one else's. That promise attracted the devout, the persecuted, and the practical. For a certain kind of merchant, the theology of non-interference translated without much distortion into a philosophy of commerce. The Brown family arrived in the 1660s and spent the next century building a trading empire out of Narragansett Bay. They ran ships to the West Indies. They dealt in molasses, rum, and African slaves. Not incidentally, not reluctantly. John Brown, the most commercially aggressive of the 4 brothers, was indicted in 1797 as one of the first Americans prosecuted under the new Federal Slave Trade Act and was convicted. The family endowed a college in 1764. It became Brown University, and continued trading. Providence did not ask them to choose. The charter said nothing about what a man did with his freedom once he had it. And so the city accumulated a particular character, layer by layer, decade by decade. It was not cynical, it was not lawless. It was something more specific and more durable than either. A place where the habit of not looking too closely at another man's affairs had been elevated in the founding generation to a moral virtue. Where conscience was private, commerce filled the public space. By the time Providence turned toward the sea in earnest, at the close of the 18th century, it had already learned the essential lesson. The harbor was open. Chapter 2. A Cheap Idea About Gold. The harbor was open. What came through it in the years after independence was not silk or rum or molasses, not primarily. It was ambition, wearing the face of practicality. Providence had learned to move goods. Now it would learn to make them. In the winter of 1794, a silversmith named Nehemiah Dodge was working at a bench somewhere in the dense knot of workshops that had begun to cluster along the city's north side. He was not a wealthy man. He was a craftsman with a problem and enough patience to solve it. The problem was gold. Gold was finite, expensive, and democratically indifferent to who wanted it. What Dodge perfected, the exact date is 1794 by common attribution, was a method of fusing a thin sheet of genuine gold onto a base of copper or brass, bonding the layers under heat and pressure, and rolling them together until the surface was indistinguishable, to the naked eye, from solid metal. The resulting material wore like gold, looked like gold, and could be worked like gold. It cost a fraction of gold. He called it rolled gold plating, and historians of American manufacture credit him as the first manufacturing jeweler in the country. The consequences were not immediately visible. They rarely are. What Dodge had done in that Providence workshop was sever a connection that had held for thousands of years. The link between the appearance of wealth and the actual possession of it. A woman in a mill town could wear a ring that caught the light the same way a merchant's wife's ring caught the light. Not a copy, not a fraud in the legal sense, but an honest imitation sold for exactly what it was, at a price ordinary hands could reach. The gold had always meant something. Dodge kept the meaning and dropped the price. In a single technical innovation, he had planted the seed of the entire American costume jewelry trade. The method spread the way useful ideas spread in a port city, quickly and without credit to the source. By the early 1800s, dozens of small shops had opened within walking distance of one another on the city's north and east sides. They were drawn by Dodge's technique, by Providence's existing metalworking tradition, and by the cheap labor pooling in the narrow streets below College Hill. A craft economy of individual benches became, within a generation, something closer to an industry. Low-ceilinged rooms where men and women bent over findings and settings and chain links, producing jewelry by the gross, selling it by the case to traveling merchants who carried it west and south into a country that had never before been able to afford to wear gold. Jabez Gorham arrived into this world in 1792, the son of a Providence family with no particular distinction. He apprenticed as a silversmith, as young men with mechanical aptitude tended to do in that city at that moment, and in 1831 he formed a partnership with a craftsman named Henry Webster to make coin silver spoons. The shop was small, the ambition was not. Gorham's son John took control in the 1840s and understood with the clarity of a man born into a manufacturing city that the only way to scale craft was to mechanize it. He imported steam-powered rolling and pressing machinery. He recruited trained silversmiths from England, men who brought methods no American shop had yet developed. The firm that resulted, Gorham Manufacturing Company, would become by the second half of the 19th century the largest silverware manufacturer on earth, eventually supplying the official service for state dinners at the White House. The spoons Jabez made by hand became underjawn objects produced by the thousands in a building that covered an entire city block. Not a coincidence and not an accident. A pattern. Take a luxury material, study its properties, mechanize the process of shaping it, sell it to people who could never have owned it before. Providence had learned this formula from Nehemiah Dodge and a cheap idea about gold, and it would spend the next 100 years building the largest concentration of jewelry manufacture the world had ever seen. The factories were coming. Chapter 3. The Five Wonders. They came and they came large. By the 1880s, the Providence Board of Trade had begun making a boast that no other American city could match, and that most would not have believed. Within a few square miles of the Providence waterfront, the board claimed, stood 5 factories, 5 separate industrial operations, 5 entirely different trades, each one the largest of its kind on Earth. The largest machine tool works, the largest file factory, the largest screw factory, the largest silverware works, the largest steam engine manufacturer on the planet, not 5 of the best, not 5 among the top contenders, 5 of the largest. A city of fewer than 200,000 people had somehow arranged this. It had not happened by accident, and it had not happened all at once. Joseph R. Brown arrived in Providence as a precision instrument maker, a man who thought in thousandths of an inch at a time when most machinists thought in fractions. In 1853, he took on Lucian Sharp as a partner. Sharp handled the business. Brown handled everything that required thinking. In 1867, Brown perfected the micrometer caliper, adapting a French instrument shown that year at the Paris Exposition, a hand tool capable of measuring to 1/1000th of an inch. The significance of that number was not decorative. Interchangeable parts, the entire logic of American mass production, depended on components machined to tolerances so fine that one could substitute for another without fitting. Brown and Sharp were not merely building tools, they were building the instruments with which every other American factory would build its tools. By 1899, the Brown and Sharp works covered 293,760 square feet on the banks of the Woonasquatucket River and employed just over 2,000 men, up from fewer than 20 when Sharp first signed his name to the partnership. George Corliss was operating on a different scale entirely, not the scale of thousandths of an inch, but of acres and tons. Corliss founded his engine company in Providence in 1856 and spent the next 2 decades building steam engines of increasing improbability. For the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition, the celebration of 100 years of American independence, Corliss delivered what would become the most famous single machine of the 19th century. The Centennial engine stood 45 feet tall. Its flywheel measured 30 feet across. It produced 1,400 horsepower, enough to drive through 1,400 feet of underground shafting, every machine operating in the exhibition's 13-acre machinery hall. On opening day, May 10, 1876, President Ulysses S. Grant walked to the engine's base and threw the switch himself. The hall came alive. Looms, lathes, printing presses, pumps, all of them running on a single Providence engine. Reporters wrote that it was the symbol of what America had become. They were not wrong, but they had the geography slightly off. It was the symbol of what Providence had built. The William Nicholson File Company and the American Screw Company were quieter operations, not the kind of firms that received presidential dedications, but their production numbers told their own story. Nicholson's workers cut more files than any factory anywhere on Earth. American Screw turned out more screws than any operation in any country. The humble fasteners that held the nation's machinery, its railroads, its buildings, and its furniture together with the same anonymous reliability. A screw is not a glamorous object. Neither is a file. Neither, for that matter, is a micrometer caliper. But a city without them does not build anything that lasts. The precision behind all of it, the micrometer's tolerances, the coreless engine's machined valves, the uniform thread on every screw coming off the Providence line, was the same precision that a jewelry shop foreman expected from the women drawing wire in Gorham's factory, from the engravers cutting dies on Spruce Street, from the men running the rolling mills that turned a core of base metal into something that caught the light like gold. Providence did not make two kinds of things. It made one kind of thing over and over in every trade it touched. Something small, something exact, something built to look like more than it cost. The jewelry trade had been there first. It would outlast every one of the five wonders. Chapter 4. The Jewelry Capital of the World. The jewelry trade had been there first. It would outlast every one of the five wonders. And by the final decades of the 19th century, a single name had attached itself to the city the way a hallmark attaches to metal. Permanent, identifying, impossible to separate from the thing itself. Providence was the jewelry capital of the world. The numbers make the title earned rather than boastful. In 1880, Rhode Island counted 142 jewelry firms and roughly 3,300 workers. Three-quarters of them concentrated in Providence proper, in the dense brick mill buildings that pressed south from downtown toward the Woonasquatucket. By 1890, the count had climbed past 200 firms and nearly 7,000 workers in the city alone. One in every 4 pieces of jewelry made anywhere in the United States came out of these buildings. Not a regional curiosity, a national fact. Walk the jewelry district in those years, and what you encounter is labor in its most granular form. The smell reaches you first, pickling acid in the vats, the iron-sweet tang of soldering flux, the chalk-dry powder of polishing rouge hanging in the air like a fine mineral snow. At the benches sit the Irish, the French-Canadians, the Italians, the Portuguese, wave after wave of newcomers who arrived in Providence because Providence had work that required patience and small hands and a tolerance for repetition. They worked by the gross. They were paid by the gross. The finest work in the country was produced by men and women whose names do not appear in any trade catalog, only in the rent ledgers of the boarding houses that surrounded the mills. Into this world, in 1869, came a Norwegian named Engelhart Ostby. He had been trained at the Royal School of Art in Oslo, had crossed the Atlantic with a draftsman's eye and a craftsman's discipline, and found his way to Providence the way skilled men found their way to Providence in those years, because that was where the trade was. He worked for existing firms. He studied the market. He understood that the ring, of all jewelry forms, was the one piece a working family would always find reason to buy. In 1879, he partnered with Nathan Barton and founded Ostby and Barton. Within 2 decades, the firm had grown into the largest ring manufacturer in the world. Not the largest in New England, not the largest in the country, the largest on earth. The Norwegian trained in Oslo had built his empire on the same instinct Nehemiah Dodge had worked from a century before. Identify the one piece the mass market cannot do without, then make more of it than anyone else, and make it cheaper and make it well. The city had learned that lesson and built its identity on it. It had also learned, without quite articulating the knowledge, that wealth and catastrophe maintain no respectful distance from each other. In April 1912, Engelhart Ostby was returning from Europe. He was aboard the RMS Titanic with his daughter Helene. When the ship struck the ice and the crew began filling the lifeboats, Ostby put Helene into one of them. He went back below to the cabin to retrieve warm clothing. He did not return to the deck. His body was pulled from the North Atlantic 12 days later. Recovery number 234, cataloged by the crew of the cable ship Mackay Bennett. When the body reached Providence and required formal identification, the man who confirmed it was one of Ostby's own factory employees. He recognized the ringmaker by a ring. The largest ring manufacturer in the world was identified by the thing his factory had spent 30 years producing. Helene survived. The firm survived. Providence kept making rings. The jewelry capital of the world had staked its claim not on a single genius or a single firm, but on the accumulated weight of 7,000 workers, 200 firms, and a neighborhood that smelled of acid and rouge from one end of the decade to the other. What had been built on craft and immigrant labor and piecework by the gross was about to discover what happened when the machinery of mass production caught up with it. Chapter 5. The Crown at its Height. The machinery caught up in 1929. That year, the Coro Company purchased a large plant in Providence and built the largest costume jewelry factory in the world. Not a workshop, not a manufactory, a factory in the fullest industrial sense, stamping and plating and assembling pieces by the millions. Coro and its crosstown rival Trifari dressed half of Hollywood. Their rhinestone brooches and base metal bracelets moved through every department store in America, from Macy's to the 5 and dime counters of 1,000 smaller cities. Nehemiah Dodge's cheap idea about gold, take a luxury, mechanize it, sell it to everyone, had found its true scale. This was not jewelry as an heirloom. It was jewelry as a newspaper, purchased, worn, replaced. Stand on Sabin Street on a weekday morning in 1928. The air carries it before you see anything. A layered chemical smell, part acid, part metal rouge, part machine oil, sitting over the district the way coal smoke sits over a steel town. The brick mill buildings run shoulder to shoulder for block after block. 5 and 6 stories of dark American bond brick, their loading bays already loud at 7:30. Through the tall factory windows you can see the benches. Rows of them, hundreds, thousands, men and women bent over presses and plating vats and stone-setting jigs, their hands moving in the quick, repetitive rhythm of people paid by the piece. The sound is a continuous low industrial thunder. The percussion of drop stamps, the hiss of acid tanks, the rattle of tumbling barrels polishing metal against metal, on Eddy Street, on Custom House Street, on the narrow blocks between the signs read Uncas Manufacturing, Waite Thresher, Theodore W. Foster and Brother, Breyer Manufacturing, each building its own small city of labor, each one feeding a national appetite that seemed, in 1928, to have no ceiling. Walk 2 blocks west and the district changes register. Up the slope toward Federal Hill, the pushcarts are already out. Vendors selling bread and salt cod and chestnuts roasted over iron drums. The social clubs on Atwell's Avenue opened early for the men working night shifts at the bench factories. The bakeries have been going since 4 in the morning. This is Italian Providence, which is also jewelry Providence, because the men and women at those benches are largely the same people whose families arrived from Calabria and Sicily in the 1890s and 1900s, who learned the trade in the mills and never left it. The same hands that set stones at 8 in the morning play cards on Federal Hill at 2 in the afternoon. And then, turning back toward the center of the city, you see it. The Industrial Trust Tower stands 26 stories above Westminster Street, completed just that year, its pale limestone rising clean above the older commercial blocks around it. The tallest building in all of New England outside of Boston. Art Deco in its upper registers, with a chamfered crown that catches the morning light and throws it back white against the sky. 250,000 people live within the city limits. The building rises above them like a declaration that Providence is permanent, that the formula works, that a city built on the minding of small, exact things has earned the right to something monumental The tower does not suggest doubt. The numbers confirm what the tower announces. The city's population reaches 253,504 in 1940, making Providence one of the most densely industrial cities in the United States. The jewelry industry does not stop there. Employment in jewelry climbs for another 4 decades, reaching 32,500 workers in 1978, a figure that would have seemed impossible to the 3,300 workers of 1880. As late as 1986, roughly 900 jewelry firms operating in the Providence area still produce around 80% of all the costume jewelry made in the United States. Note the arithmetic plainly. The city's population peaked in 1940. Its defining industry did not peak until 1978. The crown stayed bright after the city beneath it had begun to dim. That gap between the arc of the city and the arc of the industry is not a coincidence. It is an opening, and into openings, other things move. Chapter 6: The Man on Federal Hill. The social clubs on Atwell's Avenue had a particular rhythm. Men gathered after the shift, after the bench work and the wire drawing and the soldering, and the tables filled and the cards came out and the espresso moved in small cups. The street was loud in summer and close in winter, and it was alive in the way that streets are alive when people use them without thinking about it. That life was real. Running alongside it, in the same block, behind the same facades, was something else entirely. At 168 Atwell's Avenue stood Coin-O-Matic Distributors, a company in the vending machine and pinball machine business. It also operated as National Cigarette Service. The storefront was unremarkable, the kind of place a man walks past without registering it, which was precisely the point. In the back room of that building, beginning in 1954, Raymond Petriarca conducted the business of the New England Mafia. He would continue to do so for 30 years. His organization answered to him and he answered to no one. And from that single back room on Federal Hill, he ran gambling operations, loan sharking, and labor rackets across 6 states. The place had a name among those who used it. They called it the Office. Patriarca was not a large man, and he was not theatrical. He did not require the city to know what he was. What he required was to be left alone, and Providence, by long habit, extended that courtesy. The scale of what he built was out of all proportion to the size of the city in which he built it. Providence in 1954 held fewer than 250,000 people. It was a manufacturing city, compact, ethnic, post-war. Not Chicago, not New York, not a place that appeared on any conventional map of American organized crime. Yet the entire New England underworld, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, reported to a back room on a hill in Providence. The FBI understood, eventually, what that room contained. In March of 1962, federal agents planted a listening device inside the office without a warrant, and for more than 3 years, until July of 1965, it returned what became one of the more significant intelligence windows American law enforcement ever opened into the structure of the American Mafia. Roughly 7,000 pages of summarized conversation. The Bureau spent decades trying to dismantle what Patriarca had assembled from that address. It was not easily dismantled. The city around the office was, in certain ways, a hospitable environment for an economy that preferred not to announce itself. Providence was a city of small shops, of family operations, of precious metal moving through hundreds of independent hands, gold and silver weighed out on benches, transactions settled in cash, value transferred in forms that left no particular paper trail. Not every metal worker on Federal Hill or in the jewelry district knew anything about Raymond Patriarca. But the texture of the place, the small scale, the cash economy, the insularity of the trade, created conditions in which the line between the legitimate and the illicit was, at minimum, difficult to locate. Cities that process large volumes of untraceable material tend to develop complicated internal economies. Providence was not unusual in this. It was merely, by the standards of its size, unusually organized. The founding paradox was not lost on anyone who looked at it carefully. Roger Williams had come to this ground in 1636 on the proposition that a man's conscience was his own. The principle had survived 3 centuries and become something close to civic character. Not indifference exactly, but a durable conviction that what a neighbor did in his own house was not your affair. That had been the city's virtue. It had served the city well. It was also the precise condition that allowed a man to run 6 states from a vending machine company on Atwells Avenue without remarkable interruption. While Patriarcha organized the back rooms, other forces were already moving through the factories. For Chapter 7, The Factories Leave. The decline did not arrive as a single catastrophe. There was no flood, no fire, no closing day that the city could mark on a calendar and mourn in the proper way. It arrived as subtraction, a foreman not replaced, a shift reduced, a contract moved, a building left dark on a street where 3 shifts had once run without interruption. The city did not fall. It was slowly, quietly, methodically emptied. The population had peaked at 253,504 in 1940, the year the Industrial Trust Tower still signaled permanence over the skyline, the year the jewelry district still employed a quarter of the working city. Through the 1950s and 1960s, the white middle class moved outward, to Cranston, to Johnston, to the suburbs that highway construction had placed within reach. Providence lost residents, the way a reservoir loses water in a dry summer, not in a rush, but steadily, incrementally, with a new low marking every season. By 1970, the population stood at 179,213. Among American cities losing population in that generation, only Detroit bled faster. The factories followed, or preceded, or accelerated the departure. The causality wound too tightly to separate. What is clear is the sequence of closings, each one described at the time as a response to market conditions, to the changing economics of the trade, to forces no single company could resist. The language was always of inevitability. The result was always the same. Gorham went last among the great names, and its departure carried the full weight of what the city was losing. Textron, the conglomerate, had acquired Gorham in 1967, a transaction that said everything about what manufacturing had become. A craft operation absorbed into a holding company whose business was the holding of companies. The Adelaide Avenue Silver Works opened in 1890 and expanded across the following decades into the largest silverware operation on Earth, ran for another 19 years under Textron management. In 1986, after 96 years of continuous operation on that site, the works closed. The benches went still. The molds, the dyes, the polishing wheels that had processed silver by the ton, dispersed or idled. The largest silverware maker on Earth had come into being on a stretch of Providence industrial ground and departed from that same ground without ceremony. The jewelry trade did not close so much as migrate. Through the 1980s and into the 1990s, costume jewelry manufacturing moved to Asia, where labor cost a fraction of Providence wages. The logic was precise and merciless. Find the cheapest possible production wherever it exists. Nehemiah Dodge had built the Providence jewelry trade on exactly that logic. Make it cheaper than anyone else. Substitute base metal for gold. Bring the luxury of ornament down to a price the working world could afford. For a century and a half, that logic had favored the city. Someone, somewhere, could now make it cheaper than Providence could. The city that had invented the cheap idea about gold was undone at last by a cheaper idea still. The numbers recorded the departure without sentiment. The 32,500 jewelry workers of 1978, the peak, the last year the district could still claim a majority of American costume jewelry production, fell to 13,500 by 1996 and kept falling. Not a contraction, a dissolution. The 900 firms that had clustered in the old district thinned steadily, not all at once, not in a single announced wave, but one firm at a time, one building at a time, one family's livelihood at a time. The jewelry city was, by degrees, ceasing to make jewelry. What remained for a time was the physical residue of the industrial century. Mill buildings with "for lease," painted on brick that had absorbed 100 years of soot and weather. Loading docks that had once handled freight around the clock standing empty on streets where nothing moved. The immigrant families, the Italians, the Portuguese, the Cape Verdeans, the Armenians who had worked the benches for 3 generations, watched the work leave without any institution prepared to replace it. The city was broke, emptying, and ungoverned in any coherent sense. Into that vacancy, in 1974, stepped a 33-year-old prosecutor named Vincent Cianci with a plan to bring it back. Chapter 8: The Prosecutor. Vincent Albert Cianci Jr. was born in Providence in 1941, the son of a doctor raised in a city that had been bleeding jobs and people for 2 decades before he was old enough to notice. He studied law at Marquette and then at Loyola University School of Law, returned home, and joined the Rhode Island Attorney General's office, where he made himself useful on the anti-corruption strike force. By 1972, at 31, he was part of the prosecutorial effort to bring a felony charge against Raymond Patriarca, the same Patriarca who had been running the New England mob from 168 Atwells Avenue since 1954, the same office that the FBI had spent years trying to crack. The jury acquitted Patriarca. It was not an unusual outcome for cases involving Patriarca. What was unusual was the young Italian-American prosecutor who had stood at the government's table and pressed the charge anyway, in a city where that particular gesture carried a particular cost. The acquittal was Patriarca's. The reputation was Cianci's. 2 years later, he ran for mayor. He was 33, a Republican in a city that had not elected a Republican mayor since 1939, running against a Democratic machine that had controlled Providence for a generation. He ran as a reformer. He ran against corruption. The city, broke, emptying, its factories gone or going, its population down 74,000 since the war, was offered a prosecutor as its answer to decades of misrule. The voters made their decision on November 5, 1974. They elected him, making him the youngest mayor in Providence's recorded history. Not a lifelong politician, a lifelong antagonist of politicians. The city had decided this was a distinction that mattered. What followed was a decade of relentless motion. He was omnipresent in the way that certain politicians make themselves into furniture. At every ribbon cutting, every neighborhood meeting, every crisis that could be photographed, he attached himself to Providence the way a prosecutor attaches himself to a case, with the specific intensity of a man who intends to win and understands that losing is permanent. He rebuilt the city's bond rating. He recruited investment. He was loud, magnetic, and difficult. And for 10 years, he was Providence in the way that Patriarca had been Federal Hill. Not merely its representative, but its personification. Then came an evening in March 1983. Cianci summoned a man named Raymond DeLeo to his home. DeLeo, he believed, had been involved with his estranged wife. What happened over the next 3 hours was later established in court. Cianci assaulted DeLeo, burned him with a lit cigarette, struck him with an ashtray, and threatened him with a fireplace log. DeLeo went to the police. The Providence police, who reported to the mayor of Providence, were placed in the position of investigating the mayor of Providence. On April 23, 1984, Cianci entered a plea of nolo contendere, no contest, to a felony assault charge. Rhode Island law did not permit a convicted felon to hold public office. He resigned 2 days later, on April 25, 1984. The anti-mob crusader was removed from office not by the mob. He was removed by himself, in his own home, on a Tuesday evening, over a personal grievance. He had spent 12 years prosecuting men who believed the rules did not apply to them. He had built a political career on the proposition that Providence's problem was men who took what they wanted and answered to no one. The city had hired a prosecutor to clean up its corruption. The prosecutor had made himself a felon. He was 42 years old. He was out of office. He was not finished. Chapter 9. The Renaissance and the Raid. He was not finished. 6 years after the felony, 6 years after the resignation, 6 years after the mugshot and the courthouse steps, Buddy Cianci ran for mayor of Providence again. In 1990, the city took him back. It was not an act of forgiveness. It was an act of desperation. Providence in 1990 was a city that had been hollowing out for 2 decades. The factories gone, the population contracting, the tax base eroding into nothing. Cianci understood cities the way a surgeon understands anatomy, not with sentimentality, but with clinical precision about what keeps a thing alive. He campaigned on motion, on deals, on the specific argument that he alone knew how to work the levers. Providence believed him. He won. What followed was, by any fair accounting, a genuine transformation. Downtown Providence had spent decades burying itself. The Woonasquatucket and Moshassuck rivers had been paved over in the 20th century, encased beneath parking lots and rail decks, invisible to the city living above them. At one point, Providence could claim the widest bridged street in the world, a distinction that was really just a monument to civic self-erasure. Under the second Cianci administration, the rivers came back. The rail infrastructure was relocated. The rivers were reclaimed, rerouted, and laced with ornate bridges and pedestrian walkways. Waterplace Park was built at the confluence where the 2 rivers meet, a cobblestoned amphitheater at the water's edge, with pedestrian bridges arching over the current. And then came Waterfire. The artist Barnaby Evans conceived it, and beginning in 1994, he executed it. 100 floating iron braziers set along the river's surface, filled with cedar wood and lit after dark on summer and autumn nights. The fires burned 3 feet above the water. Gondoliers moved between them. The smell of cedar and wood smoke drifted through a downtown that had not smelled like anything worth noticing in a generation. People came, not hundreds but thousands, lining the banks, standing on the bridges, filling the restaurants that opened on streets that had been empty storefronts 5 years before. Providence called itself the Renaissance City, and for once the branding was not entirely false. The Renaissance was real. The corruption was also real. Both facts were true simultaneously, and neither canceled the other. Behind the reborn waterfront, City Hall was being operated as a criminal enterprise. Jobs went to the connected. Contracts went to those who paid. Promotions inside city government were purchased. Permits required the appropriate gratuity delivered to the appropriate desk. The mechanisms were not subtle. They were institutional, layered, and they ran through the mayor's office. Providence had rebuilt its face. Its interior workings had not changed. The FBI knew. The investigation was called Operation Plunder Dome. On April 28, 1999, federal agents executed a search warrant on Providence City Hall. The building whose every corridor Cianci had navigated for the better part of 2 decades. The search was public. The indictment came in 2001. The trial ran into 2002. He was acquitted on 26 of the 27 counts against him, not on conspiracy, not on the peripheral charges, not on the procedural accusations layered into the case. He was acquitted on 26 counts and convicted on one, racketeering conspiracy for running the government of Providence as a corrupt criminal enterprise. The judge sentenced him to 5 years in federal prison. Across his 2 terms, Cianci had served 21 years as mayor of Providence. The one conviction ended it. The symmetry was not lost on anyone who had paid attention. The man who had made his name as an assistant prosecutor going after Raymond Patriarca, the man who had stood before cameras in 1974 arguing that Providence deserved a government not run like a criminal organization from a back room on Federal Hill, was convicted of running a criminal organization from City Hall. Not a metaphor. A finding of fact, returned by a jury on which a federal judge based a sentence. The rivers still run through downtown. The braziers still float on summer nights. The cedar smoke still rises over the water. Chapter 10. What Remains? The rivers are still uncovered. The same water that ran dark and buried for decades moves through the center of the city on summer nights, catching the light of fires that were not there before. The crowds come for the fire. They do not come for what the fire illuminates, the brick walls of the former jewelry district rising above the water's edge, their windows lit from inside by the people who sleep there now in the lofts, in the converted floors, where the ring-stamping machines once ran 3 shifts. They come for spectacle. The buildings provide backdrop. The knowledge district is what the city calls it now. The mills that once produced Coro, that once ran silver chain by the mile, that once employed 32,500 people on benches with loops and pliers and acid baths. Those same buildings now hold Brown University's medical offices, biotechnology laboratories, and hospital administration floors. Interstate 195 was relocated, its elevated ramp torn down, and the land it freed opened a corridor of vacant parcels through the center of downtown. The city filled them with biotech, not jewelry benches, laboratories, not the making of things, the study of things. The official language is meds and eds. It is a bet, not a certainty. The benches are gone either way. The Gorham Silver Works did not merely close. It was erased. The city acquired the Adelaide Avenue site in 1992 and demolished the buildings in 1997, where once stood the largest silverware factory in the world. The complex that employed whole generations of Providence's immigrant families, the plant that turned out trophies and flatware for the country's wealthiest tables. There is now a public high school, a retail plaza, an open ground that the state is still working to clear of a century of contamination soaked into the soil and the pond beside it. The work that was done there will not be done again. Patriarca died in 1984 in a hospital bed, his organization already hollowed out by federal surveillance and succession disputes. Cianci died in 2016 after prison, after one last run for mayor in 2014 that he lost. After the city he rebuilt and the city that convicted him both declined to fully resolve the question of what he was. The men who embodied both rots are gone. The office on Federal Hill is quiet. The racketeering case that ran for 40 pages of federal indictment is now a footnote in a law library. Providence does not erect markers to either of them. It does not need to. The population has climbed back above 190,000, reversing the long slide from the 1940 peak of 253,504. The jewelry trade does not account for the reversal. Almost none of those 190,000 people make jewelry. The craft that named the city, that defined it for nearly 2 centuries, that gave Osby and Barton and Coro and Trifari their stamped marks, survives now in the antique cases of collectors. The mark still pressed into the metal still identifiable, traded by people who were not born when the last benches closed. The cheap idea about gold turned out to be correct about one thing. The gold outlasted the making of it. The Industrial Trust Tower stands 26 stories over the downtown it once commanded, its Art Deco limestone face unchanged, its name no longer attached to any institution that occupies it. It has been empty since 2013, its last tenant gone, its upper floors dark. On a clear night from the Seekonk River, it is still the tallest structure in the state, still the building that rose, fully lit, over the confident city of 1928, the year the rivers ran with trade and the skyline announced that Providence had arrived somewhere permanent. The lights are off. The tower is visible for miles. On summer nights, the cedar braziers of Waterfire float down the Providence and Moshassuck rivers on their iron frames, the same rivers that ran underground for 50 years, the same rivers Chianchi uncovered. The smoke rises above the water in slow columns, drifting toward the brick walls of buildings that no longer make anything. The fire moves downstream. The smoke disperses over the old mills, over the Knowledge District, over the dark tower above the skyline. The water keeps moving. The smoke rises. The tower stands black against the sky.